Hello, and welcome to the first lecture for our class, which is going to deal with the pre-1500 history of Buddhism. Glad to have you here. I'm going to do some very different things with this course. The traditional history of Buddhism is well known. You can find it in dozens of books. I don't think that in this course I need to repeat that information as it's printed. It's all available to you. Instead, I want to turn and try to deal with all the issues of interpretation, trying to re-look and to re-explore using what I call transdiscipline approach. That is, any data is good data available to us. We should try to make use of it. So let me take you into this environment that I'm trying to create. I have noted that if we map Buddhism in the sense of mapping every place where there is any indication that it once existed there, it would cover a large portion of the southeast part of Eurasia, including the islands of Southeast Asia. I call this the Great Circle of Buddhism. When you look at this vast area that Buddhism had covered from time to time, it's not that Buddhism was present all the time. In some cases, it flourished. In other cases, it declined in particular regions. Over this very large territory and over 2,500 years, the full story of the Buddhist tradition is enormous and has never really been told, because how can you tell it? How can you have a book large enough to contain all the information that's available for this wide geographic area? It's only now that we're coming into the digital age that there is some hope that we can use very large amounts of data in a way which is useful and creative for us. The first thing that we can note about the Great Circle of Buddhism was that if you look at the Buddhist tradition throughout it for 2,500 years, you get enormous numbers of differences. And that's understandable, because the Buddhist tradition spread from the Indian subcontinent into all these new cultural areas. And in each cultural area, it had to adapt in order to be acceptable or to be meaningful. And so that's why we have such a range of ideas and approaches in Buddhism. The one thing about the Great Circle is there was no central authority. There was no governance that covered these wise areas of Buddhist practice. There was no pope, if you will, in that sense of a pyramid structure of control. The Buddhism that we find scattered over this region is more like the internet. That is, nobody owns it. No one person or area or center has the ultimate authority. And yet it works. So it's a little bit like our human body. As humans, we share a vast genetic code. But humans come in all shapes and sizes and colors. And when you look at all the differences that we have between humans, it's a wonder that you can still say there is enough core genetic base that we are all still human, regardless of how we look, regardless of the genetic structures that may be shifting within us. So when people write histories about Buddhism, I often note how many people talk about the disparities between Buddhist areas. It's almost as if the historians start out saying there is Buddhism and it's a thing, it's one thing. And yet we find this difference and we find this difference. How can these Buddhists have such enormous differences? Why is it that anything goes? So when we start to study the Great Circle, the biggest thing that we're dealing with here, and we'll try to deal with in this class, is the fact that Buddhism did exist. It was once in all these places. It has no central authority, and yet it works. It remains a Buddhist tradition. Whatever the differences are, there is still a basic part of it that leaves it as Buddhism. So let me take you into some of the ways in which I think we can begin. This is not the total picture I'm giving you today. This is a starting point for how can we study such a wide area of the world over such a long period. Well, if we go back to the origins of Buddhism, it happened in the Ganges Basin. That is, it happened in the area in which the drainage was all to the Ganges River, which emptied into the Andaman Sea. Within this area, Buddhism developed. And the question is, how do we use this geography to understand it? What was there about this environment this location that helped to set patterns which were helpful, maybe even essential, as Buddhism spread far and wide. What was there about this particular area that would have brought to the fore a tradition which was to become a world religion? And so that's why when I said we use transdisciplinary approaches, we can use geography, we can use physics, we can use psychology, we can use anthropology, we can use climatology, we can use economics, we can use mathematics even, as well as looking at the religious and spiritual factors. So the first big question we have for the great circle of Buddhism is, it started here in the Ganges. And yet the Ganges area cannot define it as it began to spread far and wide. But at the same time, it's never completely separated from this region. So it behooves all of us who try to study Buddhism to be aware of what was going on in this geographic location, which gave rise to the tradition. Ganges is one of many rivers that flow across the surface of the subcontinent, which we call India, but includes as well other nations. When you look at this map, one of the things that you should keep in mind is that the Indian river system primarily flowed in large amount to the east. And that because it flowed and the rivers primarily emptied into the sea on the east coast, that would make part of our study of how Buddhism spread outside of the Ganges is by recognizing first, the Ganges flows to the east. We go farther south, the Krishna River flows to the east. In other words, we're going to find that a cultural pattern was created for the Indian subcontinent by the fact that rivers flowed mostly to the east. Now, a few emptied into the Indian Ocean. Those were up in the northwest. The Indus River and the other few rivers that were emptying into the Indian Ocean in the northwest. The cultural pattern that develops up there is not identical to the pattern that was created along the eastern coast of India. The pattern that came in the Indus is because they were on the two banks of the Indus, were faced with the rest of Eurasia, and they dealt with always bringing into India the influences that were being generated to the West. So we're using here geography. We're using the idea that we need to have a wider view of what was happening in India, partly because of its geography. And the geography was very much defined by rivers. Well, there were also mountains. The Himalayas to the north, of course, was very influential in Indian history. It was so high and so almost impossible to traverse that it isolated India from China, for example. But in the subcontinent itself, there were these smaller hills, which were called Ghats. And because of the way in which the subcontinent is formed, these hills were not the coastline, but just inland from the coastline. There were the Western Ghats that went down the west coast. And then there were the Eastern Ghats, which covered the eastern coast. And the Eastern Ghats were broken up because the rivers flowed through them. The Western Ghats, the rivers don't flow through them, so they're a solid mass of mountainous terrain. So we know from the Ghats that the real force of like the East Coast is very, very much coastal. The minute you move away from that coastal region into Ghats and travel up onto the Deccan Plateau, you're already moving into areas which have less agriculture, less population, less means of transport. So Ganges, as you can see from the map, lay outside the region of the Ghats. The Ganges had direct connection, if you will, through the northern area, all the way up to the headwaters of the Indus. And that whole northern region was to become one of the dominant political and cultural centers for the Buddhist, as well as the Indian tradition. So we've seen, number one, Buddhism starts out in a river system. It is a river system that has a connection to a number of other river systems and also to the geography of mountains. Well, one thing we know about the Ganges, as you can see from this map, it's now an area of the world where the rainforest has been totally cut away. But during the time of the Buddhist, the Ganges Basin was a giant rainforest. And a rainforest is a very special kind of place. Rainforests are filled with very tall trees, usually. And it's almost barren underneath the tall trees because the trees are fighting with each other to reach to light. And in a rainforest, the life is primarily in the canopy. It's not on the ground. And so the animals and the creatures that had to survive in a rainforest were struggling with that issue. So when the Buddhists developed, it was in a rainforest. And we shouldn't forget that. The rainforest at times is very daunting. It can be dangerous. There are wild animals, there are snakes, there are insects. The rainforest usually has seasonal flooding, and it can be very barren at the same moment. So what happens when you have such a rainforest? And how do you make use of it? So with the rainforest, we see that people had to cut out islands within the rainforest where they could have some land to grow food on, to build towns, to build their culture, and to have a place to live. So in an interesting way, we just have islands of urbanization in the rainforest. And it was in these islands of urbanization of the rainforest that Buddhism found its home. So that means in a rainforest, agriculture is not a big issue, except to have enough food to survive on. Until you clear the rainforest and make vast fields on which you can grow larger amounts of crops, the life in a rainforest is not the life of agriculture. It is a life of survival and figuring out how to live in islands that are protected from the rainforest itself. It's takes me to the next thought. I really appreciate the work of Johannes Bronkhorst. Johannes Bronkhorst is at Lausanne in Switzerland. And he makes a very persuasive argument when he says, we need to revisit the geographic location of Buddhism. And when we do so, we also need to revisit what was the cultural features of that landscape. So if I move away from the idea that we can understand Buddhism without its geography, in a sense, Bronkhorst says you can't. His position is this: the geographic area of Buddhism was the Ganges Basin. That was not a place at the time of the Buddha where there was a strong Brahmanic Vedic tradition. That strong Brahmanic Vedic tradition was to the west, more toward the Indus and the plains and the areas that were tied to the Indus in the northwest. So when people say that Shakyamuni was a rebel, a reformer, that he was, of course, as the tradition, brought up in a Brahmanic Vedic culture, and he rebelled against it, and he was therefore a reformer. A lot of Western literature makes him sound like Martin Luther. But Bronkhorst makes a good point. Was he really a rebel against his environment? Was he somebody who was reforming the culture in which he had been raised? And the answer which Bronkhorst gives, and I think he's got something, that this was an area distinctly different than the Brahmanic Vedic cultural tradition. And that Shakyamuni should be seen not as a rebel against a Vedic Brahmanic culture, but seen as the son of the Ganges basin of his time. And what was that? Well, first of all, once we begin to think in these terms, one of the major things which Bronkhorst deals with is that this was an area of asceticism. This was an area where people went into the forest. It was a rainforest, after all. The forest was a dangerous place to be. The real heroes would be those who could go and live in the forest, turn their back on the little urban area islands that were cut in the forest. And Shramanas left home. When Shakyamuni left home, when he left his wife and his child, in that area where he grew up, was that something that was unknown? This area of the Ganges, this rainforest area, was in fact made up of these little island urban areas that were in communication with each other through trade. This was an area where there was no central authority. It wasn't an empire. There was no one king which ruled over all of it at that time. So one of the things that we need to explore, and we'll explore later, is that it was a type of government that was what's called in politics mandala. And we have to be careful because in Buddhism, mandala has the meaning of the circle, which is used in ritual and has all kinds of implications in terms of doctrine. But when we talk about political mandalas, they're different. A political mandala means that you have a city-state which is self-generating, self-supporting, connected to other city-states in an interchange and a communication linkage, so that there is travel, there is a flow of culture, business, trade, religious practice. But nobody is totally over all of these little city-states. So they're like circles, mandalas in the rainforest. So that says that Buddhism arose in the Ganges, which was a rainforest. The rainforest had islands of urbanization, but these islands of urbanization were independent. They were cooperative. They were able to trade and communicate with each other, but they were not governed by some central authority. So that being the case, we can look at Buddhism and say, well, the Buddhism of the Great Circle started out in a place where there was no central authority, where there were these distinct mandalas. So perhaps we will understand better how the Great Circle worked if we understand how the governance was going on at the time when Shakyamuni, who was, after all, said to be the son of a king, but a king was not of an empire. The king was of a local district, a ruler, a local ruler who was able to have enough support to be independent and yet cooperative with everybody around him. So this Shramana tradition that we see is both Buddhist and Jain tradition. They both arose in this environment. And the Shramana is a wandering ascetic. And sometimes they use very fierce practice, starvation. They go out and are isolated from everyone for long periods of time. The Jains even had their tradition, which was that the ascetic would cast off all clothing and just be in nature as they were. And they were called sky clad. They didn't have robes. They were just nude. And they walked around and everybody saw them. So in this area that Buddhism arose in, there was a strong tradition. So when you see the pictures of Shakyamuni, when he's just a skeletal frame because he's been out there in the forest practicing these very difficult aesthetic issues, they understood that. That was perfectly understandable, we think, in that region. So that's why when we begin to look at Buddhism, we need to give up the idea that we can understand Shakyamuni's heritage by looking at the Brahmanic Vedic tradition instead of looking at the Shramanic tradition of his environment. So one way to describe what was present during the time of the Buddha is that what's called the second urbanization of India was taking place. The first urbanization of India had been in very early days, going back actually thousands of years, in the Indus Valley, in the Indus River area. And there, people have discovered the ancient cities that existed 4,000, 5,000 years ago, and it totally disappeared. The culture that surrounded these cities in the Indus Valley have totally disappeared. Nobody knew these cities anymore. It was only when archaeologists stumbled across a couple of mounds and wondered what was in those mounds and started to dig them that they discovered large, massive cultural urban areas that once had been there. That was the first urbanization of India. The second one is when we go to the Ganges. And the second urbanization was when the islands were cut out of the rainforest and small city states, that is a city which had its own local control, began to develop. So Buddhism arrived as an urban religion in a way, because the rainforests that were there depended upon trade as much as agriculture. And merchants traveled from one of these islands to the next. They traded all kinds of objects and things between those places. And because you had this urbanization developing, you had the development of a merchant class. And when Shakyamuni came along, we have the story of how he began to travel with these merchants as they moved from one of the little islands to the next. And so that's how Buddhism, in a way, became a merchant religion. It was a merchant religion because of what had been going on in the second urbanization of the Gangetic Basin. So I hope you can see a little bit of what I'm trying to do. I don't know if I'll be successful, but what I'm trying to do is to look at Buddhism from every possible angle and to understand it in terms of its homeland, the culture that surrounded it, and to be leery of the later works written by Brahmanic followers who wanted to make Buddhism just a second cousin to the Vedic tradition. I think that this second urbanization was an incredible development that had nothing to do with Vedic. And that within this environment that was developed in the second urbanization, it permitted a religion to emerge, which was not tied to the land, as you would be with agriculture, not repelled by mercantile activity. Far from it. Thriving within this mercantile urbanization trading pattern. So the Indian merchants who traveled, what did they carry? Sometimes it was precious stones. We find stones from Sri Lanka, for example, scattered throughout the basin. We find lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all lapis except for a few places on earth. All the lapis that we read about from Egypt to India and China came from one mountain in Afghanistan, and that's still the case. A unique kind of upheaval of minerals that form this particular semi-precious stone. So the merchants were trading spice, in particular, black pepper, but other kinds of spices. So spice belongs, I think, to an urban culture. Every time you go into an urban environment in India and you go to the marketplace, that's what you see, spices of all kinds, because people are very involved with food and dining, not just subsistence eating, but specialized eating of food that is wonderful. So money is very difficult to come by. What do you use for money? Because how does somebody pay me for something? Well, sometimes it's barter. So you say, here, I have this ounce of black pepper. I'll trade it to you if you give me something which you manufacture locally here. That doesn't always work because there needs to be some abstract way in which wealth can be put into a form that is transmissible. So people in ancient India seem to use cowrie shells as currency, or sometimes the conch shell. And so you can see down there, even in the Indus civilizations, those ancient ones, we see workshops where they were dealing with shells, seashells. That the early money system was based on seashells. And that's, of course, we think, how can you attribute value to a seashell? Because people can go down to the sea and pick up as many of them as they want. But if you don't live at the coast, they're rare. And so if people agree that, okay, this is worth a cowrie, and I know that I can take the cowrie shell and say to somebody else, I notice that you have a piece of cotton cloth, I'll give you a cowrie shell for it. And if they agree, then trade begins to take place, and money and wealth is being determined in an abstract form. So we come to Buddhism, and this is what the course is going to be. The Buddha abandoned his home. He left it. He was a shramana. We have pictures of him. He got on his horse, and the horse jumped over the wall of the city, or his little island. And so Central Asia, they were trying to think how a horse could jump over such a high wall. And you can see there the spirits, the God-like spirits, have each taken hold of one of the feet of the horse, and they're lifting the horse up so it can get over and take Shakyamuni away from home and into the forest, where with his very extreme practices, he is going to attain enlightenment. I hope you can see from what I'm saying here that we need to relook at all our history of Buddhism and reevaluate what we will take to be the important methods by which we understand the history and the development of it. So thank you very much. I'll see you next time for lecture 2.